Here, a space between spaces. One of billions of life uncertainties, teetering on the brink. To the right, the gateway to a tale of allegiance, betrayal, and resurrection. A true David and Goliath battle. One in which there were two Goliaths, Sega and Nintendo. A battle in which David, Sony, surpassed and became the new Goliath himself, and took his rival's place as the leader of all their followers. Followers who would in turn eventually rebel against the hand that fed them, and tear down the barriers separating the regions, creating hundreds of paths to follow. To the left, an unplanned synergy between two parties would lead they to establish dominance within their shared universe, an efficacious monopoly, where all opposition would crumble before their might. Who am I, you ask? Time and Tide, my friends.
The late 80s and early 90s saw a vicious battle between Sega and Nintendo for dominance of the video game market. NEC put up a big fight with their PC Engine line of consoles, but NEC were just one of many contenders who tried to make their mark and just, well, came and went. The Atari Jaguar, the Philips CDI, the 3DO, and Neo Geo line of consoles. These were all worthy contenders in the console wars, but only one had what it took to change the game. The Sony Playstation needs no introduction. PlayStation was, and still is, an industry standard of the next video game generation. It pushed the envelope in terms of graphical prowess, 3D environments, and gameplay, and ultimately pushed games on par with cinema-level presentation. No longer were games pixelated characters running and jumping through equally pixelated 2D environments. Suddenly, these were living and breathing worlds that we, the gamers, could just go out and explore. The PlayStation didn't just change the game, it dominated it. The PlayStation vanquished Sega as a hardware manufacturer and left Nintendo generations behind. Even today, Sega now merely develops third-party titles for PlayStation, and Sony's only serious competition is Microsoft with their Xbox line of consoles. Nintendo would continue to have its die-hard fans, but its systems would barely register as competition, at least not until the Wii, but let's not get too far ahead. Kids of today can easily look at a DualShock controller and automatically associate it with PlayStation. But for kids of the 90s, there's that nagging feeling whenever they hold a DualShock. Why does this feel so familiar? Well, maybe this will jog your memory. What do you know, the DualShock looks and feels very similar to a Super Nintendo controller. The 4 buttons are the same, the D-pad is the same, the rounded edges are the same, even the upper shoulder buttons are the same. The only thing missing are the handles and the lower shoulder buttons. There's a reason why the PlayStation controller feels so much like a Super Nintendo controller. The PlayStation was originally going to be a Super Nintendo peripheral. Sony's surprise dominance over the video game market was ultimately the result of a series of blind luck and business deals gone bad. Up to the late 1980s, video games were never expected to be played on anything else other than cartridge or card-based media. But NEC and Sega both realized that CD-ROM technology opened the doors to great new possibilities and would be the way of the future. This led to the CD add-ons released for the PC Engine and Sega Mega Drive. Nintendo had previously dipped their toe into expanding the functionality of their systems with the Famicom Disk System, which allowed the Famicom to play proprietary floppy disks. But it was never released outside Japan. For their new 16-bit system, the Super Famicom, Nintendo contracted Sony to produce a CD-ROM attachment that would plug into the bottom of the SNES. Sony would also develop a 2-in-1 system that would play SNES cartridges and the SNES CD-ROM games, essentially Nintendo's equivalent of the PC Engine Duo and Sega Multimega. That 2-in-1 system would be called the Nintendo PlayStation. I think you can see where this is going. Everything seemed to be going well up until the last minute, when Nintendo reread the contract and realized that they had painted themselves into a corner. While they would be producing CD-ROM games for the new peripheral, Sony would be the ones making all the profit from both hardware and game sales. Nintendo would see no money out of it. They tried to get Sony to adjust the contract so that the proceeds from game sales would go to Nintendo, but Sony wouldn't budge. When negotiations didn't work, Nintendo secretly struck a deal with Philips, Sony's main competitor, to produce the CD add-on. Nintendo would make money off the CD-based games, Philips would make profits on the hardware sales, and to sweeten the deal, Philips would be allowed to release Mario and Zelda games on their CDI system. At the Consumer Electronics Expo in 1991, Sony unveiled their 2-in-1 system, and proudly announced their collaboration with Nintendo. The very next day, Nintendo publicly humiliated Sony by denying any such joint venture, and revealed that it would be Philips making the CD add-on. Objection! Sony wasn't happy. They sued Nintendo for contract violations, and as an act of revenge, they formed Sony Computer Entertainment, which developed games for the Sega CD like Sewer Shark. Essentially, it was Sony's way of flipping the bird to Nintendo and saying, "You want to work with our competitor? That's fine, we'll work with yours!" Sony didn't just make games for Sega. They also offered to release the PlayStation as Sega's next-generation console. Sega of America were impressed with what Sony was proposing and were all for it. But Sony's offer was not supported by Sega of Japan, who ultimately had other plans for Sega's next platform. The offer was declined. Development of the Super Nintendo CD was constantly delayed, and after nearly an entire generation of development hell, it was ultimately scrapped. The only thing ever to materialize out of the Philips deal were 4 notoriously bad Mario and Zelda games for the Philips CDI. The less said about those, the better. In the end, it was Sony who had the last laugh. Behind the scenes during all the legal battles, Sony secretly continued work on the PlayStation console. They stripped it of the SNES cartridge slot and released the PlayStation as a standalone 32-bit CD-based system. The timing seemed perfect. Sega had not one, but 2 pieces of hardware that they were touting as their next-gen system. A 32-bit add-on for the Genesis called the 32X, and the CD-ROM based Sega Saturn console, both of which were difficult to program games for. Nintendo's new console, the Nintendo 64, was a true juggernaut of 3D graphical power. But after the SNES CD fiasco, Nintendo stuck with cartridges, which unwittingly and greatly limited the storage capacity of the games. PlayStation, on the other hand, offered the best of both worlds. It was easy to develop games on, and used CDs, which could store games seemingly infinite in size. So, it was no surprise that third-party developers left Nintendo and Sega. They all jumped ship over to Sony. The one that hurt Nintendo the most was Squaresoft, developers of the hugely popular Final Fantasy series. Adding insult to injury, not only did Final Fantasy VII push sales of the PlayStation, previous entries in the series that were either not released in the West or heavily censored or changed by Nintendo were re-released on the PlayStation as intended. Games like Final Fantasy I and II. The real 2 this time. The versions of Final Fantasy II and III previously released on Super Nintendo were actually 4 and 6, heavily censored and retitled as 2 and 3. A fact which became apparent when Final Fantasy IV, V, and VI were re-released on PlayStation. Likewise, various Sega exclusives were soon ported to the PlayStation when it became clear Sega's hardware wasn't selling. Such titles as Lunar, the Silver Star for the Sega CD, and Lara Croft, Tomb Raider from the Sega Saturn. Yes, believe it or not, Tomb Raider, which we all associate with PlayStation, was originally a Sega Saturn game. And it was not just Sega and Nintendo games either. Atari Jaguar games, 3DO games, you name it. Any great game that was once seemed doomed to fade away with the obscure console it spawned on quickly made the move to PlayStation and saw instant success. Rayman was ported from the Jaguar to PlayStation and spawned a whole slew of sequels. Need for Speed originated with the 3DO, jumped ship to PlayStation, and became a franchise. The unique, stealth-based spy series Metal Gear was originally only released in Japan for the MSX line of computers and had some notoriously butchered ports on the NES. The third in the series, Metal Gear Solid, became a huge success on the PlayStation, pushed the boundaries of what the system could do, and further pushed sales of the system. The unthinkable had suddenly become a reality. A mere electronics company triumphed over the two juggernauts of the gaming industry and relegated them to second banana. The PlayStation became the new home of what was originally its competitor's most popular third-party franchises, as well as gave birth to a whole multiverse of new video game franchises. Gran Turismo, Time Crisis, Siphon Filter, Crash Bandicoot, Wipeout, Silent Hill, Driver, and of course Grand Theft Auto. But of all the franchises available on the PlayStation, there is the one we're all here for. You are looking at Ranma 1/2 Battle Renaissance. Like the majority of Ranma games from the Super Famicom days, it's another fighting game involving your favorite Jusenkyo misfits. It even brings back manga-exclusive characters like Ryu Kumon and Rouge. Although unlike its predecessors on Super Nintendo, this game borrows more from Virtua Fighter or Tekken 2 than Street Fighter. As you can see, the game showcases the PlayStation's advancement of technology, with the characters represented as three-dimensional polygons, rather than the 2D sprites the Super Nintendo is famous for. As can be expected from a Ranma game, all the characters' famous moves return. The Hyu Shoten-ha, the Shishi Hokodan, the Hoppo Fire Burst, they're all here! And if you are playing as one of the Jusenkyo victims, new challenge is introduced by random rainstorms and geysers popping up out of nowhere and with almost no warning. You don't want to be on the wet side of the battleground when it starts raining. Obviously, the cursed forms have advantages and disadvantages. Ranma maintains all his attacks regardless of his gender, but the power of said attacks are greatly reduced when he's a girl. He's also more vulnerable, taking more damage as a girl. Ryoga's attacks are pretty much negated as Pichon. All he can do is headbutt. Similarly, all Shampoo can do in cat form is jump and scratch. But surprisingly, their small size makes it easier to dodge projectile attacks. If you ever wanted to play a game in which Pichon defeats Ranma by merciless headbutt, this one's for you! In Panda form, all of Genma's human attacks are replaced with paw jabs and belly flops, thus adding to the difficulty. And of course, in addition to a versus mode, it has a story mode too, which will be told differently depending on which character you select. But before we get to that, let's talk a bit about how you would actually get to play this game in the first place. If you live in Japan, Ranma 1/2 Battle Renaissance and the means of playing it are readily available to you. The original PlayStation was such a huge success that when Sony released the PlayStation 2, they made it fully backwards compatible with PS1 discs and all its peripherals. Memory cards, controllers, light guns, etc. The PlayStation 3 was also backwards compatible with PS1 games. The earliest models even supported PS2 discs. You'll know you have the right one by the number of USB ports and panel revealing SD card slots. So, for the Japanese Ranma 1/2 fans, you're pretty set. Just pop the disc into your PS1, PS2, or PS3, and you'll be good. For those of us outside Japan, you don't have that luxury. As is the case with almost all of the previous Ranma games, this one never got an international release and never got an English dub. Worse still, PlayStation games are region protected at the BIOS level, and trying to get around this region lockout is no SNES or Sega scenario. There are a lot of options to consider, but nothing is really clear-cut. It's also not a matter of, how do I bypass this region protection on my system, but which system? If you're playing on the original PlayStation, your options typically involve swapping discs. If you've ever closely inspected a PS1's disk drive, you'll notice there's a little button into which a plastic stick on the interior of the lid is inserted. This is to let the console know the door is shut. The first thing you'll need is a spring or some other pointed object to keep this button pushed down. Now you'll want to know what model you'll have. The earliest PlayStation consoles had a port on the back labeled Parallel I/O. This was likely intended for some kind of hardware expansion module, similar to the Sega Mega CD or Super Famicom Satellaview. But while no official peripherals were released for this port, cheat devices like Game Sharks and Action Replay took advantage of it and enabled players to get around region lockouts to play import games. Simply insert the cheat device into the Parallel I/O port, pop in a random game from your region, and power on the console. When it gets to the Action Replay or Game Shark menu, swap the regional game with the import title and select Load Game. Haha! Success! However, this port on the back was removed from later models of the PlayStation. If you have one of these later models, you won't be able to use these cheat devices. Alternative options included using boot discs. Game Shark started releasing their PlayStation cheat software on CD. There were also dedicated region boot discs like PSX Change 2. With these, you simply pop in your boot disc, wait for the cheat menu to load, swap the boot disc with your import, and start the game. But one major Achilles heel to all these disc swapping options are games that used multiple discs. Normally, when you played one of these games, it would prompt you to change discs, and since the game is a licensed product, the PlayStation would happily stop spinning the disc once it detects you've opened the door, allowing you to replace it with the next one and continue as normal. But because you've got a spring stuck in the button, the PlayStation doesn't know you've opened the door, so the disc continues to spin. Even if you manage to swap it out without losing your fingers, the console still doesn't know that you've replaced it. Fortunately, you shouldn't run into such issues with Battle Renaissance, because while there are two sides to Ranma's body, his PlayStation game only has the one. PS1 consoles are generally simpler options for playing imports. Moving up to a PS2 is where things get more complicated. While the PS2 is backwards compatible with PS1 games, it too was region locked. Even more so than the original PlayStation. While the original PlayStation had a simple lid enclosing over the disk drive, the PlayStation 2 used a motorized tray. And while boot discs were available for PS1 and PS2 games, the motorized tray meant you couldn't easily swap discs. Getting boot discs to work on the original fat PS2 required modifications on the console to even work. For obvious reasons, the PS2 Slim didn't have this issue, as it reverted back to a simple door. An alternate method of playing imports on the PS2 is to play them as rips off a hard drive, either a USB thumb drive or even a desktop hard drive. The original fat PS2 had an expansion bay into which a full-sized desktop hard drive could be inserted. While Sony intended this as a supersized memory card, hackers found ways to run entire games off the hard drive regardless of region, using Free McBoot, a memory card loaded homebrew enabler, which used programs like Open PS2 Loader and Popstarter to play rips of PS2 and PS1 imports respectively.
300 TV stations, network, 3 satellites, 10 senators.
If you're looking for a plug-and-play option, it might be easier just to install a mod chip in your PS1 or PS2. The only simpler option would be to buy a Japanese PS1 or Japanese PS2. But, buyer and beginner beware. PlayStation mod chips are no walk in the park. They make installing the Super CIC look like a lesson zero. Firstly, there are many revisions of the original PlayStation, and how you install the mod chip will vary depending on which model you have. Secondly, in the case of the PS2, there are many different chips to install, but they all require you to solder 50 wires connecting to the PS2's motherboard. These 3 consoles have all been mod chips. Yes, that's how many I went through to get this far. I first found this one in the trash whilst walking down the street. This is an original PAL model SCPH-30002. It has been chipped with the Apple 75K. It played all US and Japanese games I threw at it, but ironically, it lagged considerably trying to load games that I bought here in Australia. For the longest time, I had both my unmodified and modified consoles hooked up to the same television. I was happy with this setup, and then the mod-chipped console died. It wouldn't read the discs. I tried cleaning and replacing the laser, but nothing worked. Much more recently, I acquired my second mod-chipped console. This is also an SCPH-30002 and is chipped with a much more common Modbo 5.0. Unfortunately, this one kept crashing whenever I tried to load a game. It would detect the game, boot it up, and then crash to a black screen shortly after the on-screen logo. And the disc motor made a very violent grinding noise, almost as though it was put through a CD shredder. The third mod-chipped console that I acquired is a later SCPH-30002R model. The 30002R models, and even later models of the 30002, all had revised boards. The internal revisions are most obvious. On the outside, the most obvious change is the location of the iLink port. On the original 30002 models, it's near the bottom USB. On revised 30002 models, and even 30002R models, it's near the top USB. But does it work with the Modbo? Yes it does, but at first I thought the console was defective. Initially, it wouldn't detect PS2 DVD-ROMs, or even video DVDs. Then, for reasons unknown, it promptly read them on the first try as though nothing happened. Another curiosity is that it wouldn't work with free McBoot memory cards. It would detect the apps, but whenever I tried to select one, the console would crash. Loading free McBoot off a USB stick got me around this issue. That's not to say that all PlayStation mod chips are shoddy, but it is testimony to the difficulty in trying to play these imports. If you have a working mod-chipped PS2, you have the ultimate plug-and-play experience. But for those looking for something more versatile and user-friendly, sometimes the best modifications are the ones that require no surgery.
The PS3 will play PS3 games and Blu-rays from any region, but unfortunately PS1 and PS2 games are still locked to whichever region the console was bought in. Getting around that requires some good hacking skills. If you have a PS3 running custom firmware, you can use programs like Multiman to load backups of PS1 and PS2 games from any region, even on later PS3 models stripped of their PS2 disc backwards compatibility. The PS4 is not backwards compatible with discs from any previous generation of PlayStation. Only recently it was discovered that some PS1 games could be forced to run on PS4 using an exploit of the Medieval remake, which includes an emulated version of the original PS1 game as an unlockable bonus. However, game-by-game compatibility is very hit and miss, and we cannot confirm that this will be an option for Ranma Battle Renaissance. Sony's latest console, the PlayStation 5, is only backwards compatible with PS4 games. Since jailbreaking a PS4 to run backups of PS1 and PS2 games is still quite iffy, don't expect to play Battle Renaissance on a PS5 anytime soon. Obviously, Sony's line of PlayStation handhelds and the PlayStation TV microconsole don't support PS1 discs, but they have a very interesting alternate way of playing these games. Believe it or not, you may want to consider them for playing your collection of PS1 imports, even over the original hardware. The PlayStation Portable was programmed with a PS1 emulator. This emulator carried on over to the Vita and PS TV and included support for PSP emulation. These emulators were obviously intended for digital re-releases of PS1 and PSP classics purchasable from the PlayStation Store. A selection of PS1 classics are available for download. There are even digital releases of games that were never released outside Japan. But if you had hopes of buying Battle Renaissance through the PlayStation Store, I'm sorry, but you're out of luck. Not by official means, anyway. In recent years, hackers found ways to exploit the official PSP emulator, and the floodgates have opened to all kinds of possibilities. And with that, the true potential of this emulator has been realized. The official PSP emulator is not limited to Sony's selection of digital re-releases. You can play digital backups of your physical disc collection, even the multi-disc games. Simply use ImageBurn to rip the games as Q and bin files, and then use the program, PSX to PSP, to convert these bin files into eboot.pbp files, which you can then load onto a PSP running custom firmware, or a Vita running the Adrenaline app, which installs this PSP custom firmware as a secondary operating system for the Vita. Later models of the PSP supported component video output, allowing you to connect your PSP to a television and play your games on TV, essentially turning it into a Nintendo Switch before the Nintendo Switch was even invented. The PSP Go even had Bluetooth compatibility, allowing you to sync it with a DualShock 3 controller, and thus giving you a full set of shoulder buttons for the PS1 games that use the L2 and R2 triggers. Similarly, with Sony primarily marketing the Vita as a PS4 remote play device, many third-party companies released L2 and R2 trigger grips for the Vita. These trigger grips work just as well with PS1 games. And while the Vita lacks its predecessor's video output option, you can play its games on a big screen, using its PlayStation TV microconsole counterpart. And the great thing about Sony's handhelds is that they are 100% region-free, meaning that you can play backups of all your imports. Of course, you could also just load pirated copies of these imports downloaded from the internet if you felt so inclined. But putting your legally purchased games to good use is part of the fun, right? Right? The ability to play digital backups of PS1 games from any region on both your big screen TV and on the go make the PlayStation Portable and PlayStation Vita perhaps the ultimate way of playing these imports. You don't have to worry about whether or not your PS1 or PS2 still work. You don't have to perform any surgery on the hardware. All it takes is a simple little hack easy enough for a child to do, and you'll be good. And speaking of emulators, what about PS1 emulators that you could download on your computer for playing these imports? That's a perfectly fine option too. I mean, that's what I use! The PlayStation was so popular that PC and Mac emulators for it have been around for almost as long as the PlayStation itself.
We're really excited about games, and again, our goal is to have the best game machine in the world. Now, this is another game machine. It's the most popular game machine in the world. Wouldn't it be great if we could play some of those titles too? Well, at Macworld today, Connectix is introducing the Virtual Game Station. It is software. It is software that they're going to sell for $49 that turns your Mac into a Sony PlayStation.
Some emulators will even allow you to put your legally purchased games to good use, and even give the graphics a boost. But perhaps the most exciting news in the emulation community is the soon-to-be-released Polymega. Previously, we've been able to use emulation-based clone consoles like the Cyber Gadget Retro Freak to play our collection of cartridge games from consoles like the Sega Mega Drive and Super Nintendo. Now, for the first time, CD-based games are no longer left behind. For all intents and purposes, the Polymega is set to offer the exact same experience for disc-based games including the Sega CD, Sega CD32X, Sega Saturn, PC Engine CD, and of course, all 3 regions of PlayStation. Pre-orders for the Polymega are currently being accepted, and it may be out by the time you are watching this video. So, with all these options to consider for getting Ranma 1/2 Battle Renaissance to play outside Japan, how does it stack up? First impressions mean a boatload, and from the opening moments this boatload of hotshot teens arrive on the shores of Kikaiga Island, Ranma fans will be hooked and reeled in. There is no denying the trademark Ranma 1/2 charm and authenticity, feeling like a story ripped right from the pages of the manga. You don't have to be Japanese to appreciate the whole original Japanese cast is on board, and fans of the anime will most definitely love the inclusion of Ryu, Kumon, and Rouge, 2 characters never given the full motion treatment until now. In terms of variety, the game gives us 8 player characters, which is more than adequate, many of whom are 2 characters in one, thanks to the unique Squall system which changes the forms of the Jusenkyo Cursed mid-battle. All the characters look great, very true to their counterparts, and despite being produced in that hazy period where 3D gaming was still in its experimental phases, the graphics still hold up pretty well to this day. The backgrounds are fun and detailed, showing off disparate parts of the island and its 360 capability, and the music features some real catchy tracks, adequately scoring the on-screen ballet of brutality. Fan service is through the roof in this game, as the characters are all equipped with their signature moves from the series, with Easter eggs being plentiful and welcome. All in all, you can't argue the presentation. Ranma 1/2 Hard Battle for the Super Nintendo is a tough one to beat, but this is a very close second. As far as everything else goes, this is a game in heavy need of polishing. As stated, this is a very early 3D fighting game along the lines of a Virtua Fighter. Going back and playing those games can be tough, as they feel extra slow and floaty, but there's one thing that can be said about most of them. The player is given 3 dimensions of control. In Ranma 1/2 Battle Renaissance, yes, there are ways to move in orthogonal directions, but the 3D is largely cosmetic, and the fighters are locked together in a straight line. With some attacks rivaling the speed and fluidity of Battle Arena Toshinden, blocking and countering an opponent's attacks becomes an exercise in frustration. More often than not, the player will find himself trying to readjust after the opponent has broken from the line, at that absolute wrong angle where the player can't hit the opponent, but the opponent can certainly hit him. At the beginning of every round, where the 2 fighters are positioned in such close proximity, it's easy to be helplessly mauled by speedier opponents until you have the opportunity to get away and come up with a strategy. Once trapped in a combo, you are helpless but to eat oncoming blows until the end of the chain. With all these fun, flashy moves at one's disposal, it's tempting to want to use them, but many of these are unreliable. After enough defeats trying to beat the opponent at his own game, it becomes easy for the player to find that one cheap move to break through his foe's defenses and abuse relentlessly just to get on with the game, which, obviously, is not fun. The Squall, once it hits, bathes the screen in a blinding white light as the PlayStation struggles to load the new character forms. When the light dies down, the player is left blinded and disoriented for a second or 2. But that matters not to the computer-controlled player. Be prepared to take some real cheap damage in that brief moment of blindness. In many cases, it will turn the tide of battle to your opponent's favor. Being knocked down on your back comes with its advantages, as you can roll out of your opponent's line of attack to dodge oncoming blows, but the true fighting game fan will find it clunky and confusing, not only to have to worry about physically rising to his feet, something automatic in most other fighting games, but to be vulnerable to attacks while on the ground. If I may interject a personal experience to prove a point, when I was young, I used to love the game Super Punch-Out, and I like to think I was pretty good at it, but I could only get so far as the opponent Hoi Quarlo. It wasn't so much that he was challenging, it wasn't so much that he was cheap. My problem with him is that, unlike all the other opponents, he wasn't animated well. Many times I would get hit or knocked out, and I'd be left scratching my head wondering why, because I couldn't make sense of what he had done to me. It was like trying to box a random flickering image. Which brings me to Ranma 1/2 Battle Renaissance, and its inclusion of short, knee-high characters such as Pichan. The Squall system, including all the Jusenkyo transformations, on paper was a great idea. The hardcore Ranma fans are gonna want to see them, they almost had to be in there somehow. In practice, however, it is practically a game breaker. For the affected player, the whole repertoire of maneuvers is rendered void, replaced with an ineffective nudge attack. No combos to speak of, just one singular attack, which half the time harmlessly passes through the opponent with no rhyme or reason. When on offensive against a pint-sized opponent, yes, you have full use of your character's moves, but 90% of them will now sail over your opponent's head, leaving you open for attack. To hit Pichan or Shampoo's kitty form, one can only use low kicks, sweeps, or fireball attacks, unless you are extremely lucky to catch they while airborne. It is novel for a fighting game to include opponents which force you to completely change up your fighting style, and even some classic games like the original Street Fighter and Karate Champ would occasionally challenge you to strike a small target being hurled your way. But these were games of chance. Succeed and get a point bonus. Fail, no harm done, the game goes on. This is the actual game, reducing it to the worst controlling game of Gacha Last imaginable, one heavily dependent on luck. It is easy to believe most players will not choose Ryoga Hibiki or Shampoo, just to free themselves of the hassle. Now it's true the squall can be successfully avoided with practice, but this forces Ryoga and Shampoo to multitask in the heat of battle, putting they at a disadvantage. Also keep in mind, one character, Happosai, is naturally small, so if you thought you can make it through the whole game without dealing with this annoyance, think again. As for the final boss, Rouge, in all my years playing through fighting games, I have never seen a more cheap boss. Rouge will use and overuse her purple orb attack, repeatedly forcing you to the other side of the screen where none of your attacks will reach, and you are horribly ill-equipped to avoid it. Sidestepping is difficult, and most characters shuffle forward at a wounded pace, so getting close to her takes nothing short of mastery. Simply doing damage to her is an accomplishment. Defeating her? Almost out the question. Yes, it is fitting in fighting games to have a challenging final boss to test your abilities, but it's a fine line between challenging and cheap. Mercifully, despite everything else being in Japanese, the main menu text is in English, making the difficulty setting easy to find. I suggest setting it to its lowest setting. It will save you a lot of headaches. It cannot be understated. The play control will be a bigger adversary than any you will face on the island. And this does not solely infect gameplay, but the menu interface as well. In Japan, the circle button is generally used to confirm, and X is used to cancel. In the US and even PAL regions, these controls are switched. In Battle Renaissance, it seems the developers couldn't decide. On the main menu screen, you first must press Start or Circle to access the selections. Now Circle makes the selection while X cancels you out the menu. If you select the Story mode, the game then asks if you want to load from a memory card. Now, both Circle and X confirm. Up next is the opening cutscene. Again, both Circle and X are used to skip it. But then you get to the character select screen. Now only Circle confirms, while X cancels you all the way back to the main menu. If you're used to playing by American controls, it can be frustrating just trying to navigate. It's easy to end up back at prior submenus due to an incorrect button press, all due to bad design. Being on disk-based software, obviously there will be load times, and by themselves they are not offensive. It's the sheer amount of load times before a single battle in story mode, which will have the player rolling his eyes. During gameplay, especially if a particular opponent is giving you trouble, you will have to wait for not one, but several screens to load. Each defeat will send the player back to the map screen, where selections must be prepared again from scratch. Pre-fight cutscenes play before every battle, and while they can be skipped, they each have their own separate load times, adding unnecessary waiting time. All this could have been solved with an on-screen prompt to either rematch or return to the map. Instead, be prepared to go through this arduous routine every time you lose a fight. The map system plays like an overhead world hub a la Super Mario 3, and provides a fun little scavenger hunt, ripe with secrets, strategies, and even a sound test if you can find it.
You have one new message.
おう、ランマだ。悪い、今ちょっと出かけてて留守なんだ。用事のあるやつはメッセージ頼むぜ。
But many will wish they could just bypass this section and skip to the next round like a regular fighting game.
You win. Round 1. Fight.
Do not play the story mode if you are an impatient person. To conclude, Ranma 1/2 Battle Renaissance is a fun excursion, and superfans will want to own it simply for its faithfulness to its source material. The whole package is fun and charming, and undoubtedly a unique piece of Ranma history which should be experienced. But this is mostly a showpiece, high on aesthetic polish, lacking in substance. Compared to other games of its type, Ranma 1/2 Battle Renaissance is too frustrating to be fun, and too short to be worthy of a purchase. The control is the most glaring issue here. Though it's not the worst and can be mastered with enough practice, it will still lead to many wrongful frustrations and defeats, leaving the game feeling incredibly cheap, and difficult for all the wrong reasons. After playing for about an hour or so, you will see everything this game has to offer, and it's not a whole lot. For those who crave a nice two-player fighting game to pass the time with friends, yeah, there are a lot better options. Throw a dart and you'll hit one. But if you want to inject a little Ranma into your fighting, here's another one. And it's bound to bring you and your friends some shouting and smiles. But, as a single-player experience, does it make sense anymore to call this a solid rental? The die-hard Ranmaites will want to have it in their collection, but it pales in comparison to Ranma 1/2 Hard Battle, which, to reiterate, was not the greatest itself. Try it for yourselves and see, but if you skip it, you won't be missing much besides a sore set of thumbs.
A Ranma 1/2 character profile! This profile was brought to you in part by JW Studios. Special thanks go out to Jason Doyama for his translation guide.